So thank you to the organizers for inviting me to talk here, and to IGC for funding this research. This is joint with Lauren Brandt, Napalm Snow, Vern Henderson, and Qinghua Zhang. So what we want to do is we want to understand the effect of transportation infrastructure on prefectural economic growth in China, sort of since the market reform started. Right? And in particular, we want to try to understand the scale at which infrastructure operates, the scale of infrastructure which affects economic growth. So does it matter if and you think that these things are all likely to be correlated, so teasing this apart is going to be hard. Right? But we want to know whether it's infrastructure that serves travel within the city, between the city and sort of the surrounding areas, or to international ports. Right? Second is we want to compare reduced form and structural estimates to see how important technique is. All right? And then finally, I think it's reasonable to think that a first-order effect of reducing transportation costs is to cause people to change where they do things. Right? Not necessarily to cause them to do more, but simply to do it somewhere else. And if you're not really careful, that's going to look like growth. Right? So we want to try to be careful about distinguishing between those two things. All right, so infrastructure is a big chunk of public policy expenditures. And if we want to choose this level of expenditure wisely, we need to know its marginal effects. Right? So to do that, it'll be helpful to know where we should build stuff. What's the marginal contribution to growth or welfare of roads that serve different purposes, or railroads that serve different purposes? How much of these changes in levels are actually growth? And then finally, again, there's this issue of technique. Right? So there are a lot of papers on this now. So this is a partial list, and I sort of put numbers here, which are basically the number from the abstract for how important infrastructure, roads or railroads are. You don't necessarily want to compare all of these, but we have some papers for China, some for I think a very important paper by Dave Donaldson and Rick Hornbeck for the U.S., for the 19th century U.S., 18th century U.S., a couple papers for India, right? Some for Africa. These two, I think it's probably fair to compare. Right? I think it's probably fair to compare those two numbers. This is a structural paper. This is a reduced form paper. You're getting wildly different answers, right? And so it looks like technique matters, right? And so if you look and say, why do we need another paper on infrastructure? I think there are three reasons. First is the literature hasn't yet done very well on determining the scale of infrastructure which is relevant. All right. So as I said before, is within city or between regions or connections to the rest of the world. It hasn't done very well distinguishing reorganization from growth, and we think we have a trick for that. That's really hard, both in fundamentally, if you're going to get the effect of roads by comparing a place with roads to a place next to it without, then that research designed by construction, you lose the intercept, so you can't tell whether the place next to it is losing or the place with it is winning. So we think we have a trick for that. And also, this literature has not focused very much on cities. Right? For the most part, I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot more attention paid to roads or infrastructure as a way of dealing with rural development than with urban development. So there's some holes here to fill. I think there's some important holes to fill in, and that's what we're going to try to do. Right, so the outcomes that we're interested in are population and GDP growth at the prefectural level. So if you don't know about the way administrative districts are organized in China, prefectures are 10 counties. All right, basically they're 10 counties. A big MSA, I think, is probably fair. All right, we're going to try to worry about causal effects. So we'll talk about instrumental variables a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because of time. We're going to worry about growth and reorganization, and we're going to do both structural and reduced form estimates so we can try to get a sense for how important is technique in the answers that we get. All right, so here is the short version of what we're going to do. We're going to take some change in outcome, so this will be change in GDP or population at the prefectural level. Right? And we want to know how that varies with some measure of roads inside the city, so the count of rays that emanate out from the prefecture, for example. Some measure of how you are connected to the stuff that surrounds you, all right? So things within a 6-hour drive or some other theoretically found measure of market access, and how you're connected to the rest of the world, so international market access. Right? So and because we're worried that you can look right away at this and you think, well, there's the inference problem here is that I think that anything that affects productivity, any unobserved thing that affects productivity ought to affect infrastructure. I worry that the equilibrium process for assigning infrastructure to places should depend on how much economic activity is in that place, right? And so that's the basic inference problem that we're worried about. We're going to solve that by instrumenting, so we'll have all these first stage equations. So we can't estimate this credibly. That would be a silly thing to do, so we're going to do it in pieces and do the best we can. All right, so here is what the road network looked like in 1990. It was all secondary roads. There were no limited access highways. All right, here is the limited access highway network in 2010. Can you see that okay? I can't tell if there's enough contrast. You see it in the back? All right. So there was a well-developed limited access highway network by 2010. This is just an astonishing thing to do in 20 years. All right, and this is something that we're going to use for an instrument. This is the 1962 road network in gray, and then a plan, the primordial plan for this network before it was built. We actually don't use that network anymore. We're just using the 1962 network for instruments. All right, so the first issue I want to deal with is how are we going to measure being connected to a region around you? Okay, so if you look at we have a handful of models that do this, which make slightly different suggestions. All right, so the easy version sort of comes out of NEG, the new economic geography models, and there you just basically add up the stuff that's around you, discounting by how far away it is. All right, and we're going to implement that by adding up everything that's within 6 hours drive from you. So this is basically we did this for a whole bunch of different rings, so we could do this thing non-parametrically. All right. In the end, I'm only going to show you stuff that involves things within 6 hours drive. But the measure of market access is the sum of all economic activity in prefectures that I can drive to within 6 hours on whatever network is relevant. All right, excluding yourself. All right. So. We're going to focus on travel by highway. All right. The reason we want to do that is that's where the innovation was. That's the thing that changed. The railroad network stayed pretty constant. We're going to focus on the thing that changed. We're in the process of thinking about we have data for the railroad network. So if you see this paper again, we'll probably be talking about the railroad network then, but not today. What we worry about is, if you go back here. I'll talk about the exclusion restriction later. All right. The reduced form measure of international access is the highway travel time to an international port. And this, I think, is quite interesting. We're going to calculate for every prefecture, we're going to draw a ring around it, this ring of 6 hour travel time, and ask, is this prefecture the biggest place within 6 hours? All right, so are you the biggest place near you? All right. If the answer is yes, you get a 1, otherwise you get a 0. So we're going to try to get a sense for whether you are the central place. All right, we want to look for whether the effect of infrastructure varies by whether you're the central place or not. Okay, and so this is what these measures look like. So this is the colors indicate this is ordinal. So dark red indicates that you are you have more market potential. So there's more stuff around you, and this looks just like it should. All right, the center of the country is where most of the economic activity is. All right, and then you can do the same thing for 2010, and it's changed a little bit. Not dramatically, and I think the reason for that is because by 2010 the road network is everywhere, and so there's not a lot of changes in rankings of market potential. Okay, and then here is the one based on the instrument. The instrument, this is the instrument, and I'll show you this, having postponed talking about the exclusion restriction, which is based on the 1962 road network and also old GDP. All right, so the structural version of this comes from the Donaldson-Hornbeck adaptation of the Eaton-Kortum classic trade model, right? And so in that model, I'll do this twice, once for people who don't speak trade and once for people who do. All right, we're going to imagine having a couple of cities, all right? We'll have some finite number of cities, origin, destination, and each city will produce a continuum of goods between 0 and 1. Right? Everybody has CES preferences. Everybody's preferences are identical wherever they live over this continuum. You have perfect competition, constant returns to scale, and importantly, total factor productivity is a Frechet draw for each good. All right? So what this means, and iceberg trade costs. So here's an example. So if Ed and I are both cities, all right, Ed is, and suppose that we're identical but we don't trade, all right? If we don't trade, then what's going to happen is I'll produce everything myself, and so my prices will reflect my average productivity and Ed's too, all right? If we're allowed to trade, what should happen? Well, then there'll be three types of goods. There'll be the goods that Ed's better at making, and then he'll ship those to me. Conversely, I'll ship some, and then there'll be things that are about the same, and we won't trade those. Right, and as trade costs go down, we get to specialize more. Right, the set of goods that we get to exploit our comparative advantage on gets larger. And so that's the mechanism by which trade increases welfare in the context of this model. Right, is that it facilitates specialization. Right. Now, what that means that means two things. First is that what I've just described is really an elaboration of an Edgeworth box. And so if I know transportation costs and I know our underlying productivities, I can solve for, and I know our outputs, I can solve for all the prices, right? And those prices are going to be the measure of how specialized we're able to be, which is the measure of how much stuff we're able to be connected to. Right? So in the context of that model, this price level is a very elegant summary statistic for market access. Right? And the reason that that's better than the reduced form version, summing up stuff, the reduced form version of this thing, it doesn't matter whether the city that I am connected to by the road network happens to be next to Beijing or is in the middle of nowhere. Right? And in this market access measure, we have a structure that lets us deal with that. And it lets us deal with this in this really slick way where we don't need a lot of data. Right? And so if you solve that model, for those of you who speak trade, you get two equilibrium equations, one of which describes this market access thing, which is the inverse of the prices I was just talking about. Right? This is a system of nonlinear equations, which we can solve for this. Right? So this is a trick where we're solving out the Edgeworth box to get prices as a function of from very little information and a lot of structure. Right? This is the structural measure of market access. Right? The other equilibrium condition is the relationship between output, prefectural output, and market access. Right? So this equation has land area in it and this thing. This one's key. All right? So this is something we can observe. This is something we calculate. All right? This is the mean of the TFP. This is the mean of the TFP distribution. Right? So this is the thing that describes how productive you are. It's the level parameter in the Frechet, which is a weasel word for it's almost like the mean, but not quite. All right, so here you can see the inference problem very clearly. Market access, right, involves transportation costs. This thing is the transportation cost. Right? And so if you think that roads are assigned endogenously in equilibrium, for example, if you are more productive, people are more excited to build roads into you, then we will have a correlation between this thing and this thing. Right? So we need to try to break that. Similarly, if you think that if you are productive, you have a big mean of your productivity distribution, people are more likely to want to be connected to you, then there will be that more productive people are more likely to connect to you, then there'll be a correlation between this and this, because those levels are in all of the things that you're connected to also. Right? So this this equation very elegantly, I think, describes the inference problems that we face and tells us what our instrument needs to do. Our instrument needs to predict this, but not be related to this, the mean productivity of our in our own city. All right, so that's what we're going to use is we're going to recalculate this market access variable from levels of GDP which predate the modern economy, so which we think are unrelated to the ability to make iPhones, all right, and road networks that predate the modern economy, all road networks that were determined by 1960 after 60 years, which included a revolution, a civil war, a world war, sometime as nearly being a Soviet client state, and so on, all right, before there was a market economy. So those will be the things that we want to use to predict this market access that turn out to have predictive power and that we want to claim conditional and controls are not related to this 1990 or 2010 productivity variable. Right. Now, this thing poses some problems. All right? The first is that not all the coefficients in this thing are going to be identified. These guys are all grouped together. Right? And so when we come to do welfare calculations, we're going to want to know what these are. Right? And that's going to be hard. We're going to have to do some stuff. We haven't done it yet. We're girding ourselves because it's going to be ugly. All right? These guys are not all identified. All right? It's going to be hard. It's hard to pull these things out, and it's important to do that for welfare. All right? And this is difficult to calculate. Right, so this comes at a price, but I think it's very useful both because this thing has some very nice properties in that it's a very elegant measure of market access, and because it really clarifies the inference problems. Okay, so here's what the thing looks like. This is the market access. It looks just like the market potential variables. All right? So wait, one other thing. We are going to generalize the Donaldson-Hornbeck model. We're going to split this into two components, one that results from being connected to the rest of China and one that results from being connected to the rest of the world. All right? I think that that's a useful thing to do. All right, so here's what the market access variable looks like in 1990. It looks just like market potential. Same in 2010. So statistically, it's not clear that there's a big advantage. It's going to matter very much which of these things do. The regressions are going to look about the same. All right, and here is the one we're going to use for an instrument based on 1982 employment in 1962, or 1982 GDP in 1962 roads. All right, and then here, if you split it, when we break the thing apart into domestic and international components, it looks just like it should. Domestic market access is a bigger component of market access in the interior, and bigger component of market access. International component is more important on the coast. Okay, so now data. It's too small, right? Can you see it in the back? Let me see what I can do here. Better? Yeah. All right. Here is the big outcomes: population and GDP. The short story from this slide here is log population of a typical prefecture in 1990, and in 2010, population doesn't change much. All right. GDP, log GDP, 3 log points increase in GDP between 1990 and 2010. That's like a factor of 25. All right. And you see in per capita GDP, that's about what you see. Right, so per capita GDP goes from 0.1, I think that's 1,700 yuan a year, up to 3,000 in 2010. So it's just astonishing. Uh-oh. What did I do? All right, transportation infrastructure. I have to blow this up too. All right, transportation infrastructure, big expansions in the highway network. I showed you the picture. So the number of roadways in 1990 goes from 3 in 1990 to from not quite 3 to almost 4, big increase. And I showed you the map. The highway network was upgraded dramatically, less so for the rail network. All right, I'm not going to show you much on the rail network today, but I'll show you a little bit. All right. Consistent with the pictures, I think that given that the market potential and market access measures are look so close, is there separate information in those two things? And I think the answer is some, not a lot. All right. So if I look at the correlation of the market potential measures, the reduced form measures I create just by summing stuff around me, and look at the correlation of that with the theoretical versions, correlations 0.7, 0.8. All right. I can calculate both the structural and the reduced form measures on the basis of population or on the basis of GDP. So how much population is near you, how much GDP is near you, and I get about the same answers. That doesn't matter. Now, in order to calculate the structural measure of market access, I have to assume some parameter values. I have to assume something about the gains from trade, the dispersion parameter. Right? And I need to think about, we're able to calculate network travel times, but I need to think about the value of those network travel times. Those are things that I kind of have to make up. All right? Right? It turns out these things are not that sensitive to that. Right? So the core, as I vary the parameters that I use to calculate the market access measure, I get a change in the variance of the market access measure, which is going to affect the coefficient in my final regression. Right, but I don't get that. But the things stay highly correlated. So there's not a lot of. I'm not changing the information that's in those measures in a fundamental way. All right. So here is the first regression. So this is a regression of. So ignore this. All right. Just focus on this column here. This is a regression of the change in prefectural GDP change in log prefectural GDP between 1990 and 2010 on the reduced form market access measure, time to the coast, and some controls. All right, this is an IV regression. The OLS regression looks just the same. All right, so what you see is that if this is an elasticity, so a 10% increase in the amount of stuff around you gives you a 14% increase in output. Right, so that strikes me as a pretty big number. All right. I'll talk about a more explicit welfare calculation later. As a robustness check, I can use the change in prefectural GDP as a function of the amount of people around you instead of GDP. Those things are all highly correlated, so not surprisingly, I get about the same answer. All right. Time to the coast doesn't matter. All right. All right. Time to the coast doesn't matter here. And the one divergence between the structural and the reduced form version is going to be here. Is that it won't, the time to the coast, the connection to international ports is not going to matter in the reduced form. It will matter in the structural estimates. Right? Go figure. I don't know why we're going to try to figure it out. Population, all right? This is a regression of change in prefectural population, change in log prefectural population as a function of the same thing. So how much GDP is near you, how far are you to the coast? This says people are moving closer to the coast as they get better connected, and this says changes in market potential don't affect your population. All right? And so this opens the window on our trick for distinguishing growth from reorganization. All right? What this says is that if we think that roads can affect how productive people are, but not how many children they have, so how productive they are, but not how reproductive they are, then anytime we see people move around because of roads, that's pure reorganization. Right? And so we can think about the effects of roads on total output as having three parts. One is they can cause people to move to more productive places, and two is they can cause people to be more productive or less productive in those places. If we're willing to commit ourselves to roads not affecting the rates of population growth, those two things together let us distinguish growth from reorganization. It's a calculation that we haven't done yet, but that we think is an interesting one to do. Okay. Now, if we interact the rank variable with the GDP variable, we sit with the market access variable. So this is the same. This is change in log GDP as a function of the market potential variable, how much stuff is within 6 hours of you, log travel time to the coast, and the interaction of are you the biggest city near you with the market potential variable. All right, and what you see is that this one's positive too. All right, so what this says is market access helps you more if you are the biggest city around, right? Which I think is a quite interesting result, right? What you see in population is also really interesting. Here you see what you see here is that what these coefficients tell us is that as we improve infrastructure, people move to the biggest city around. All right, so here we have productivity is going up in the biggest city around. People are moving to that city around. So that the way that roads are reorganizing population and productivity is they are improving productivity in the big cities. All right, and people are migrating to them. All right, and that looks like that is the main effect that you get out of the reduced form results. All right, if we do the corresponding sets of regressions with the structural measures, all right, you get something quite similar. You get that the market access measure, so this is change in GDP again, on the market access measure, so the structurally founded measure of how connected you are to things. You get the same thing. You get a big effect on GDP, nothing on population, right? When you break the GDP, when you break the market access measure into the international component and the domestic component, you see something else. Here you see that connection to international ports matters, right, which we did not see with the reduced form results, and that it is relatively more important than the connection to domestic stuff. We don't know how to explain that. We're working on it. Right? And again, you don't see much on population. Right? Except that as before, you see that it's good, is that people are moving towards the coast or towards places that are closer to ports. Right. Now, here is something that this is another result that shouldn't happen. All right, this is a result that I think shouldn't happen. So I talked about this market access measure and about how beautiful it is and how much information it summarizes. Right? If it's doing what it should do, then it is a complete measure of market access. Right? And in particular, it shouldn't matter whether you are a rank 1 city or not. So what we're doing here is we're taking the market access measure and we're going to interact it with whether you are the rank 1 city. That shouldn't matter in the structural model. There's no way for that to happen, but it does. All right? And so the market access matters more if you are a rank 1 city than if you are not, which I think speaks to some incompleteness in this model, however elegant it is. All right? We're investigating why this is. I think that either that's fundamentally incomplete or we have some omitted variable, and we're investigating what some of those things could be. All right, we cannot do regressions that have market access and roads in them. It's just too silly. If we put all these internal road measures in by themselves, they don't matter. So this is change in log GDP on internal measures of infrastructure. So how many rays? We can use any measure that you want. How many miles? Are there ring roads? Whatever you like. We can't get any action on this. All right. So it looks like the scale at which these things are operating is this regional scale, maybe international, we don't know. Right? So the way that roads are affecting growth is by connecting places to the surrounding places, right, that are reasonably nearby, truck distance, right, or by connecting them to international ports, although the evidence on that is ambiguous, and not by facilitating travel within cities. Okay, so the estimated elasticity of prefecture GDP with respect to market potential is about 0.15. We don't see anything similar for population. We have this result for connections to international port, which affect population but not GDP. Regional hierarchies matter. Right? When you start doing welfare, all right. You have it, how much time? Like 2 minutes, right? Okay. When you start doing welfare, you have a problem, which is that, and you can see it simply in the reduced form calculation. Suppose that my productivity goes up by 10% when, suppose that we change the road network so that my productivity goes up by 10% because I'm connected to more stuff. Right? But if my productivity goes up, then the people around me have a bigger market potential, and so their output should go up. And so to do that welfare calculation properly, you need to deal with that recursion. Right? The same is true for the market access calculation. When I change the transportation network, I need to recalculate equilibrium output in order to get the revised market access calculations done properly. That's difficult to do, and we haven't done it yet. That's coming up, and that's it. All right, so thank you very much.